Try and accept is known as exception handling, and it's a way of trying to catch errors. And also, if there's something you're trying to do that could lead to an error, you don't want it to break your whole program. And this is one of the ways around that. So there's 4 sections to a try except. There's try, except, and this is a little bit like an elif of an if statement. We could have many of these. You've then got an else and you've got a finally. So I'm going to keep it simple at the start and I'll come back to else and finally. So I'm just going to comment these out. So let's start by just focusing on try and accept. So if I open a file, so I'm going to open a file that doesn't exist. So I'm going to say f equals open text, and I'm going to make an error that you saw in a previous video if you watched through. So I accidentally wrote test files instead of text files, / test.txt. Now I'm going to open that with read permissions. So if I run this, I've got what's called a file not found error. So all of this is useful. So all of this information is useful, but the problem you've got with it is we don't want a user, which could happen. You could have a program that you're running and the user's interacting with it, and you might do something that might lead to an error. We don't want our whole program to crash and the user be displayed with all of this information, which is quite extensive. So with try except, what we could do is this line that caused the error, we could move that into here, into the try block. So what that means is it's going to try and do this. And then here with the except, we can try and catch the errors. Okay, so here, instead of writing the full error here, we could just write print error occurred. Now when we run it, you can see it's just printed error occurred. So it's a much neater experience. We can even go further than this. So we can have very specific errors. So we could say except, and it was called a, what was it called? It was called a file not found error. Okay, so we could have except file not found error. And then we could print a very specific statement here. So we could say print, sorry, no file exists. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So what we've now got is we've got our try statement. We've got an except statement with a very specific file not found error, where it's going to print, sorry, no file exists. And we've got what we've called an exception exempt, which means anything else, basically. Any other type of exception, do this. So when we run it, it says, sorry, no file exists, because this is the type of error that occurred. So if in here, let's do a different error. So let's do an assignment error, so where a name doesn't exist. So let's say x equals O. So this is going to try and look for a variable O and put it into a variable X. But it's not going to work because there isn't a variable of that name. So if we run that up here, so that will cause the first error. You can see it's now fallen to this exception block because the first error that came across was this. And so it's fallen under here and not this one anymore. So we could try and catch all the different types of errors that could occur and then deal with them appropriately. Instead of it just crashing the whole program, we can choose what to do should certain errors happen. And this should be used in really good programs for the things that might have a chance of causing an error. So that's how the try except blocks work, and that's sort of a catch-all for excepts. But again, you want to try and be specific because depending on errors, it might result into a different outcome that you want to do. So then we get to the else. So the else section will only run if the try has passed. So if this has been deemed to true, what do you want to do? So let's say, for example, I want to read the file. So let's do data equals f.read, and then print data. So when we run this, it's still going to say, sorry, no file exists, because I'm still going to have this error. However, if I change this to text files, when I run it, you can see text files.test.txt read, data equals f.read, data is not defined. I've put data minus, data equals, there we go. There, so this is the file, this is the data from the text file. So it's outputting it, brilliant. So this is working. So because this is true, it runs the else. So this is basically, if this is true, carry on with this code here. And then finally, slightly different. So finally, will run regardless of whether this is true or not. So whether this is true or not, it's going to run this finally block. So this would be used for things like closing down connections and things like this, things that you want to do regardless of whether something is errored or not. You can put it in the finally block. So I'm just going to print finally always runs. Runs. So finally always runs. So when we run this, look, so it's printing out the content of the file, and then it's running this finally block here. If I go back to getting an error, okay, so we are catching the error here, the very specific error, and doing whatever we want to do with it. But then we're also running this finally block. So you don't need, you might see a lot of code where it's just try and accept. You don't always need the else and the finally, but this is, you can have them. So it's very much focused on, depending on the use case, depending on how many different types of errors could be caused and how specific you want to be when catching them. This is all the options you've got with a try and accept. But obviously you could have many, many accepts for all the different types of errors if you need to be really specific and do different things depending on the type of error. So that's try accept, that's known as exception handling, and that's trying to stop the user just using your program, the whole thing crashing and getting a really big error statement. You can be very specific on if something goes wrong, how do you want to deal with it? And do you want to deal with it differently depending on the type of error that you might come up with?